Ladies and gentlemen, I've come many, many miles to salute the India Today Conclave. It's a great honor to be a speaker here, and it's a great joy also to return to Delhi. I have not been here for 8 years, and I wanted to see if everything that was supposed to be going on exciting in India was really that exciting. I apologize for sitting down, ladies and gentlemen. It's partly to do with the spread of material I need for my PowerPoint presentation. It's also to do with the fact that the day after Christmas, I herniated 2 discs in my lower back, and standing up for any length of time, as some of you may know, when you've got a degenerative disc, is not fun. I couldn't believe, after the 2 months of pain I suffered, that I could ever say having a slipped disc was sometimes a blessing in disguise. But as some of you may know, when I arrived at the airport at 1:30 on Thursday morning, I discovered to my horror that this time I had not brought a visa. And the last time I came in, I think it was care of the Foreign Ministry, which did all of that paperwork, so I'd even forgotten I needed a visa. So I was solemnly taken off to a back room, so I disappeared away from my expectant party outside, who thought I'd been lost on the plane, and was interrogated for an hour and a half as they pondered on which plane they were going to choose to send me back to Heathrow and then back to Yale. The senior person there sent the others out of his room, and we talked a bit. I thought my prospects improved slightly when he said that his second son was working and resident in the state of Connecticut, which is where, of course, Yale is. So we got a bit closer there, but he still said he had no power other than to send me back, except in the case of a death or poor health. And I was showing him desperately all of my email correspondence with Raj, where I had been pleading for a full-length seat to fly all the way from the States to Delhi because of my back and because my doctor didn't want me to fly. And this gentleman was just flicking through, and he stopped slowly, and he read the sentence again, and he read it again, and then he said, "You know, there could be a way out of this." He said, "I don't think there are any flatbed seats going back to Heathrow until the one you are on Saturday morning. So I am going to write you out a special brief admission to India slip, which of course I'm preciously carrying in here because I had to surrender my passport there, and I have to pick it up in exchange for my little pink slip." So as I say, I never thought before I would say having a herniated disc is a blessing in disguise, but it sure was on that occasion. My topic, which is to be done on PowerPoint slides because I figured that after lunch people need some lighter entertainment than perhaps the serious things we heard, is about India, Great Britain, and America. To my mind, the 3 of the most interesting large powers or great powers in the modern age. Empires, up on the title, I would say was loosely used there. I'm not going to get into definition of whether America is an empire or whether India is becoming an empire. We're talking about large powers with a large impact on world affairs in the modern age. And obviously we have to ask a question, well, what then is the modern age? And I think most historians would agree that it begins around the year 1500. The year 1500, when Europe experiences both the Renaissance and thought and ideas and technology, but also the rise of the modern nation state in Western Europe. But if, however, you looked at this particular map, which is of world power centers around 1500, you would hardly notice England and America. They wouldn't be on the radar screen. Probably the Qin Empire, the Ming Empire, the Persian and Ottoman empires, and the Mughal Empire are the key ones. There's Western Europe, but that's a cluster of principalities, dukedoms, city-states, and the rest. Over in the US, if I can get my laser beam on it, well, I'll show you what there is there, because we will go to the next slide. Over in the US here, there's all of the different tribes of America at that time. Higgledy-piggledy, some big, some large, no center, no real communication systems. This is Saxton's famous map under the time of Queen Elizabeth I of England and Wales, and it's divided, but it's divided all right into administrative counties. There actually is a capital. There are roads going up to Edinburgh and across to Swansea and Bristol and to the Channel ports. It is one of the new rising monarchies. But over here, you see a map which you're more familiar with than most people in the United States or in Europe, which is the period of the very significant expansion of the Mughal Empire for about 200 odd years. And the amount of territory covered here, roughly speaking, is about the size of 15 Englands. So what we're talking about is a beginning of a story 500 years ago in which India is definitely one of the great world powers. And if we go and look onto the next slide and look at the population estimates, you'll see what I mean. The best guess is that India in the 16th century had about 100 million people in it. That's very, very much larger than all of the European states put together. Then England and Wales, rough estimate by demographers, about 2.5 million people. And then all of North America, all of those tribes, consisted only of approximately 2 million people. So England and Wales have, in the 16th century, about only 1/40th of India's population. And here these scattered tribes of North America are so very different from what we think of North America today, incapable really of resisting European guns or European diseases, many of which knocked them out. Perhaps the real key to understanding the change in the story comes with the development of sea power by the Western European states. This is not obvious at the beginning of our story. As you know, when the early Portuguese ships sail into Calicut in the 1490s, they are amazed at the riches of the trade, the number of merchant vessels, the wealth of India's buildings. Truly, this was the center of the world. The reports going back to Henry the Navigator, going back to Spain, were aghast at the size and richness and sophistication of the products. The Portuguese brought various ironware and textiles to sell to Indians, and they were of a distinctly inferior nature. London was a mere town. New York did not exist. But what distinguished the European powers was precisely this capacity to organize military force at sea. It was these small Portuguese ships which had sailed halfway around the world. It was not Arab dhows or Indian ships which had sailed in the other direction, even though they could have afforded to. And of all of the nations of Western Europe, which then invested in long-range armored sea power, by armored I mean putting heavy cannon on board these sailing ships, it turned out that the most successful was the one most geographically placed, which was Great Britain itself. And the story of the next 2 centuries or more after the time of Queen Elizabeth is of the rise of English sea power, which we'll see the epitome of in the next slide, please. A familiar one to anybody who's done traditional British history or British imperial history, Nelson's flagship at HMS Victory at the Battle of Trafalgar. The great Indian historian, Professor Panikkar, called the period from 1492 to 1947. He called it a very special term. He said this was the Vasco da Gama period in world history. A phrase I read when I was about 17, and it's always stayed with me. But it was not so much Vasco da Gama, but later the Royal Navy of Britain, which gained the most for it. There was one other factor historians point to, apart from the island position and the freedom of being drawn into European wars, but there was one other singular advantage that the British came to possess, and that was the invention of steam power and the coming of the Industrial Revolution, as we'll see illustrated in this. Could we go to the next slide, please? Illustrated in this early shot of the beginnings of the iron and then later the iron and steel industry in the Midlands of England. I think it's impossible, ladies and gentlemen, to exaggerate the significance of the Industrial Revolution. It substituted an inanimate source of energy, that's coal, for the animate power of human beings or horse-drawn power or cattle-drawn power for the first time. And it created a kind of upward-moving technological adaptation and increase in productivity, particularly with the invention of the steam engine, which transformed not only Great Britain, but it transforms the rest of the world. And it's still transforming the world today, this interaction of science, technology, industry, new invention, and enhanced productivity. So the effect of the Industrial Revolution and the British doctrine of free trade, which accompanied it, the effect upon Britain was significant, but the effect upon India and upon India's great handloom textile industry was extremely severe. Let me try to show to you. I wonder how many of you have ever seen the following statistic. Let's go to the next slide. This slide, yeah. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, I sent a couple of discs of these slides to the organizers and to the magazine. I have no intention of taking them back with me to Yale. I have them copied there. If any of you are intrigued by these, then I think perhaps India Today might be able to oblige you by making a copy. But look at this. This is quite staggering. It's from the great Swiss economic historian Pierre Bayrock's article on levels of industrialization. And he reckons that before steam power really gets underway, that is in 1750, Britain and India had the same per capita level of industrialization. Of course they had. They each had horse-drawn transport. They each had lots of craftsmen. They each had traditional textile and some iron production. They each had vast numbers of hungry peasants. They each had landlords, maharajas, and dukes who skimmed the cream of the economy's profits. They were similar, just not similar in size, but similar by other margins, particularly per capita industrialization. And 150 years later, by 1900, you can see the scene has been transformed. Because of steam power, Britain's productivity had jumped ahead massively. But not only was this a jump in absolute terms, but the export of steam-driven cloth, textiles, coming from Lancashire to India, devastated the Indian textile industry. How can you compete with machines which are going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week? You can't. To go from one-to-one level equality in per capita industrialization to 1 to 100th, or 100 to 1, in a century and a half. I don't think I've ever seen that in world history. And here's the result, again familiar to all of us who had to study world history or British imperial history. It's the next slide. There we go. How many of an older generation in this room had to look at that map of the British Empire, all painted red, just at the beginning of the 20th century? Mercator projection. British always liked that because it showed that Canada was at least twice as big as the United States. And there's all of these lines of cable communication and the various mid-ocean islands. And here's all the produce coming from all over the globe to London and Liverpool and so on. It's rather amazing when you look at it. Now, some of you might have guessed the Kennedy family comes from Ireland, even if I was born and educated in England. Ireland, we Irish, were the first English colony. India was about the 15th. Never forget that. We were way ahead of you in learning what the English could do. But it is still amazing. A few small islands with 2% of the world's population conquer and rule 1/4 of the land surface and pretty well all of the sea surface of the globe, and do it for a long, long time. But it couldn't really last forever. It's actually amazing to me why it lasted so long. I once grew so tired at the plethora of books coming out in the 1960s and 1970s with titles like The Decline and Fall of the British Empire or Imperial Sunset, that I sat down and wrote an essay called Why Did the British Empire Last So Long? It's a fair question. What did they do? Was it statecraft? Was it diplomacy? Was it clever alliances? Was it the insular position? Was it that they had relationships with at least their dominions, which were friendly rather than conquering? You'll have to read the article to get the answer to that. But it lasts a long time. Then a number of factors, a number of transformations occur because, as I try to argue in my book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, time does not stand still. New technologies, new shifts in economic transformations cause alterations in the power balances over time. And the greatest factor for change in the British position, ironically, was the rise of the first successful rebel colony, namely the United States of America. Once it had achieved independence and began to expand westwards, open up its great farmlands, borrow from British industrialization techniques, copied Britain's modernization, there was no stopping its expansion. It just was an entire continent taking over, doing exactly the same of what the small island group was doing. And therefore, the next slide is just a historical recording of that, the economic eclipse of the UK by the USA. We now know that it was about 1890 that the United States, in its steel production and iron and steel production, burst past Great Britain for the first time, and then just proceeded to produce each year 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 6 times. This in an age when steel was probably like microchip today, the best indicator of modern warfare and modern power. You needed steel for warships, steel for tanks, and so on. And here, this is a one which I use to teach my students. Sometimes putting some of these graphs in front of them and say, write 1,000 words on what this all means. But because sometimes documents speak much louder and much more clearly than words, than lectures. And the US burst past the United Kingdom, not just in steel consumption, but obviously energy consumption. per capita standards of living, all the other indicators of being now the leading industrial and technology nation of the globe, and giving it the economic and productive base which was going to permit it to dominate much of the world for much of the 20th century. And here's a further thought, which I try to bring back in when I move on to the consideration of India now and in the future. Like Britain in the 18th century, like Britain in the age of Nelson, America by 1940 could enjoy increased standards of living for its populace and increased military power. Let's go to this next slide. Here we are. It's the year's about 1940. I think these are Boeing B-17 four-engine bombers, which was so vital in the American strategic bombing campaign in both Italy and in Japan. And here is I can tell from the number plate there, it's a 37 Packard. This was a nation which could produce millions of Packards and literally tens of thousands of B-17 bombers. It had guns and butter. And you want to think about that. The Soviet Union could only have guns. Scandinavia chose only to have butter. Or vodka. America had both. Here are two further indications of its military power, which I brought up to today. First, the sheer size of its weapon system. So let's go to the next slide. Wow. Here is the late 20th century equivalent of HMS Victory, USS Enterprise. You notice the names. Great powers like choosing significant names for their ships. It's quite amazing if you've ever seen one of them come into port. It's about 20 stories high. It's 4 soccer fields long. It's about 200 feet wide at that level. It has 70 modern jet aircraft with some rescue helicopter and some survey helicopters. It has, together with the air crews and the maintenance crews for the aircraft, it has a total crew of 6,200 people. It's a nuclear-powered submarine, nuclear-powered carrier, means it doesn't have to refuel its rods for about 2 years or so. And it can move, of course, 24 hours a day at about 32 knots maximum. That's about 40 miles an hour. One of these carriers was in Yokohama port when 9/11 occurred, and was ordered to sail with its carrier group, left harbor the next day. Within 6 days, it was in the Persian Gulf. There's immense flexibility of modern sea power. I said it left with its group. This is a rare photograph. You don't usually see them like that because it's on its own. This baby never goes to sea on its own. It's just, you have to protect it. We'll have 2 or 3 guided missile cruisers, some destroyers, some frigates. There'll be an attack submarine or 2 underneath this vessel. And there'll be some fuel ships, oil ships. So a carrier group would probably consist of about 8 to 10 vessels. I tried to cost what the building cost for all this was. One carrier task group probably cost between $18 and $20 billion. That's equal to the entire defense budget of Italy. The United States has 14 of such groups. You start doing the sums. It's paid for because the United States, which, remember, became independent as a result of indignation at having to pay taxes, nowadays is quite happy to pay lots of money on high defense expenditures, as we'll see in the next slide. Go back one, please. This is a pie chart taken from the famous Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Again, easy to get website source for comparisons. This was taken in 2001, before 9/11. Even then, it showed one country, the United States, with less than 5% of the world's population. It has 4.6% of the world's population. It spent almost 40% of world defense expenditures. This year, after Mr. Rumsfeld's two very, very hefty increases in the defense budget, this year the United States will be spending, ladies and gentlemen, 50% of all of the defense expenditures of the 191 nations which make up the United Nations. That's never happened in history. Not the Roman Empire, not the British Empire at its height, not Qin dynasty. There you go. This, the other, I should say, are the European states, many of whom have quite hefty defense budgets, but only like 10% of the United States. Israel, Middle East states. But I put China in comparison with India and Russia and the United States, just for a point of comparison. U.S. defense budget this year is equal to the defense budget of the next 16 highest states with defense budgets. You just have to take the Chinese defense budget, the Russian, the British, the Israeli, on it goes, put them all together, and it doesn't quite match the Pentagon's budget. Now, what about this interesting country squidged in here, today and in the future? This is intriguing. It's a snapshot, of course, and the interesting thing would be to go back and look at the pie chart in 10 years' time, 25 years' time, and see how things are. The fact that we're comparing it with the enormous defense expenditures and those of the richer countries doesn't give us a very good indication of that. India is steadily decreasing its defense expenditures from a much lower base. Let's go on to the next slide. This is measured both in current rupees, therefore inflation isn't taken care of, and this is the one in constant rupees, but there has been a steady and significant increase in defense expenditures of this country for both Army, Navy, and Air Force. It's also accumulating more defense systems, either from its own industries or from abroad. So let's look at slide 13, the next slide. There's our latest acquisition. Anyway, it's coming to us soon. Admiral Gorshkov, through deck, medium-sized aircraft carrier. I was trying to find out from one or two Indian colleagues whether Gorshkov had been renamed yet. And I don't think it is. We're clearly not going to call it ex-Admiral Gorshkov for the rest of the ship's life. And so somebody's got the right and tell me or send me Times of India when it gets named, because I want to know whether if the British have HMS Victory and the Americans have USS Enterprise, what is the Indian name going to be to symbolize India in the 21st century, the Indian century? Even so, my mention of the defense expenditures and the look at this acquired system is not the point. At least it's not the main point. Because I've been arguing in this talk, as I did in the Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, that the country cannot grow strong and militarily influential unless it has a flourishing economic base. So it has to be with India in the future. What I'm going to refer to next has attracted the attention of many economists, journalists and politicians in India in the past 4 or 5 months. It may be less known to some others, so if those of you who know what I'm going to talk about, once you see the next slide, bear with me if I take some time on it, because I think teasing this out might give us a good indication of where India is and where it may be able to go or may not be able to go. So let's go to the next slide, please. Late last year, a team of economists and futurologists at Goldman Sachs in their research offices in London did an ambitious survey going 50 years ahead into the future of the likely economic growth of 4 large non-Western countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And the acronym the Goldman Sachs folks used was to call them the BRICS, B-R-I-C, makes sense to me. And they wrote this study, of which you can get one from Goldman Sachs, if it hasn't been reprinted already in India. The study was called Here Come the BRICS. All of them are growing very fast. Even Russia now, as you'll notice, quite substantial recovery from its malaise and problems of the early 90s. And the Goldman Sachs team compared their growth rates with those of the rich G7 countries and then with the growth rates of the G3 countries, that is America, Germany, Japan. And the characteristic of the BRICS was, of course, they had some of the potential in population, in rising education levels, in potential in the use of capital, so that if they manage to keep on average, because every economist knows about the ups and downs of the trade cycle, but on average, if they manage to keep up the kind of growth rates which have been manifest for the past few years and for the past 20 years in China, then you begin to see very, very significant shifts in the world power balances. These 50-year forecasts you have to take with large amounts of salt. But still, I would like you to look at this and consider it. There's China, predicted by Goldman Sachs to have the world's largest GDP in 50 years' time, overtaking the US with India, having got remarkably close. The rest are what my father, who liked to gamble, called also-rans. There's Japan, although Brazil and Russia come next and are forecast to keep going at a higher annual rate than the rest of the European countries. We can see this in another way of representing those changes. In the next slide, please. Yeah, as I say, just another form of illustrating it, but in a way it looks more dramatic because you get the sense of the climb, with perhaps, in Goldman Sachs' estimate, India rising the fastest of all. It would be interesting to be around in the year 2050 and to pull this one out of the files and to check out this forecast, because things never go like this as a forecast, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Alas, none of us here, I think, with a few exceptions, will be around in 2050 to re-examine this. Let me return now to the theme of Britain, India, and America and put them into the Goldman Sachs forecasts. Play on them in one or two comparative ways, which will lead me to some of the question marks I have about this distinctly positive and almost teleological projections. So let's go to the next slide. This is just the GDP projections, put in another way. You can see how relatively small India's total was in 2000, quite a long way behind the United Kingdom, and of course a long way behind the United States. 2025 seems to have overtaken Britannia, but still a long way behind the United States. And then 2050, and we come back to this picture of India's total gross domestic products closing on the United States, racing after it, so to speak. The significant item to me, and I meant to ask the Goldman Sachs team, incidentally, one of them is a young Indian lady who I taught at Yale, Rupa, who helped write this entire report, is that it looks as if, yes, there's a significant increase in India's total between 2000 and 2025, but boy, there's a really big increase in those 25 years, according to Goldman Sachs. So, you know, I could stop my talk here, go to the airport, get my passport, and get back to Yale. But I think there's one or two other things before I close and then open for questions. And it is to remind you that of that basic fact in statistics, this is absolute gross domestic product of the whole population. It's not per capita income. So when we move to the next slide, we begin to kind of come down to earth a bit with the bump. Can we go to the next slide, please? This is per capita. That is to say, in the year 2000, average per capita income in the United States was about $35,000, Great Britain about $23,000, $24,000, and very low in India. It's increasing proportionally faster, but we see that in 2050, because there will be approximately 1.4 billion total population in this country, the per capita income is quite some way behind those richer northern countries. Now, I have two remarks to make about this. Even if it is further behind, to think of per capita income of 1.4 billion people at $18,000 is to imagine a transformation of a society and possibly an environment and a social fabric, which would be stunning. My second question is a more worrying one. This is an average. Is this Indian population of median income or per capita income of 18,000 US dollars, does it consist of a lot of multi-billionaires, a good number of reasonably well-off middle-class folks, and 1 billion people still at very, very low standards of living? Because this 18,000 can disguise what kind of India you get, what kind of India can emerge. And I think this came out in those two fine presentations we heard before lunch, that we're not just looking at kind of crude measures of steel output or military production. We're talking about the relative social strength and kind of domestic coherence of those three big world power or near world powers, Great Britain, United States, and India. The second caveat I have, and I'm sure some of you have been thinking about this before me, is that the Goldman Sachs team of economists, although if you read the report, they try to make allowance for possible deviations. They try to make allowance for certain things that economists make allowance for. But they cannot make allowance, by their very nature, for political, strategic, and social challenges. They cannot measure present and potential difficulties, which a group of talented bankers and consultants just cannot get into their computers. So I end up with this final slide, which is meant to be a set of question marks. So that we kind of put this together, and I'm sure it could have been put better together by many of you. Instead of looking at the kind of positive measure of India rising in a linear way, it says, well, what sort of challenges, especially in the external but also domestically, are facing India at this beginning of the 21st century, the Indian century? Let us, by all means, hope, along with the foreign minister, that we can look at that top line in 15 years' time and say, that problem is gone. We've got some solution. We have a problem which, whatever we think about our improved relations with Beijing at the moment, nonetheless, the sheer size of China's rise is going to have its ripple effects all across Asia and the Pacific. How to think about that in a cool way without getting too alarmed, or without dismissing it. We have something which was mentioned in a question this morning. After all, think about it. The linear line showing India's GDP going up and up and up depends, just like the Industrial Revolution depended, and just like the American economic expansion in the 19th century and 20th century depended, upon basic energy supplies. Now, we either get them from new forms of energy, or we get them from the traditional oil, gas, coal sources of energy, of which we simply do not have enough to meet the growth expected. I'm not one of those who think, like Adolf Hitler did, that you had to be totally autarkic and you didn't have to get any raw materials from any other country. And if you didn't have them, you went out and grabbed them. But energy dependency as a constraint on some of the Goldman Sachs projections is something I just thought I'd flag. Improving the sinews of power. Now, I take this to be a multi-dimensional thing. I took very seriously, I thought I heard very well expressed this morning, the argument that a strong country, a country of influence, cannot just be measured relatively by military muscle and economic muscle. That the sinews of power include the social fabric, include a functioning, flourishing democratic system, include many other things which go towards a country comfortable with its own self and comfortable with its own growth. And then here, the issue which concerns a large amount of us meeting the new global challenges. And I don't just mean terrorism. The failed states phenomenon right across Africa now, migration, environmental pressures. I think in these areas, India is going to be a very fundamental player. India is a fundamental player in the international machinery of things like trade rounds, of environmental agreements on levels of trace gas, and a whole number of ways, even before it gets its place as a permanent member on the Security Council. India is a big player in the international system and can have a big influence here. So I also agree with the previous two speakers that one of the elements in this sinews of power is ensuring that the leadership of this country will be, both at present and in the decades to come, composed of men and women with a great deal of wisdom, understanding, able to compose clever policies, able to understand the rest of the world. I finish by this remark, ladies and gentlemen. The challenges that India faces in the first decade of the 21st century and following that are not greater than the challenges faced by Queen Elizabeth I England in the 16th century, or by George Washington's America in the late 18th century. They're somewhat different because the world is different. They can be met and they can be overcome, provided there's wise leadership, clever diplomacy, which I regard as a very significant element here, a domestic peace and prosperity, economic progress. And this to be done without too much hubris and exaggeration, but with understanding and wisdom. And I, for one, ladies and gentlemen, am optimistic about India's future. I hope I will be proven right. But you see, I have ended with not suggesting the inevitability, but the fact that India faces a number of challenges and possibly a number of futures. And it's in your hands and in the hands of your sons and daughters. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.